Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Economics Unbound. Now, Nana and I wish those of our viewers who are writing exams the very best of luck. And to those economics students out there, this one is for you. We wish to help you with that essay on your exam script that asks about the dividends of ethics, or the ethical dividend. How and why it is profitable to be ethical. Hello, Nana.
We at the SABC announced a massive anti-corruption drive this week, Tans. Could it be that we too are chasing the ethics dividend after so many years of poor ethics and governance? We are now leading the way towards an ethics dividend. Because, Tans, I read that poor business ethics can lead to a huge devaluation for both tangibles. That is the money and the bottom line. And intangibles, that is the brand equity and value. With stocks and brand values falling for those being singled out in a lack of ethical conduct and corruption. But what are ethics, Tans?
Well, Nana, Investopedia has a very clear and academically useful definition for ethics. It says that ethics is a system of moral and ethical beliefs that guides the values, behaviors, and decisions of businesses and organizations and the individuals within those organizations. Some ethical requirements for business are codified in law. For example, environmental regulations, the minimum wage, and restrictions against insider trading. These are all just examples, Nana.
Wow, Tans, that is a useful definition. But the area we're now dealing with is a nexus between philosophy and economic theory. On the philosophy side, the theories of ethics developed by a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, an action is only ethical or good if the maxim or principle behind it is good. He asserted that parallel to actual law is moral law. Such a moral principle, according to Kantian ethics, must be universally applicable, that it applies in all circumstances. The last is that Kant said that human beings should never be treated as objects, but as ends in themselves. So, in a system of ethics, we cannot use other human beings as instruments and objectify and mistreat them. A humanist view of the role of human beings in business and life in general was emerging and developed as a result of Enlightenment thinking.
Now, Greek philosopher Aristotle's non-contradiction concept states that just actions or good actions cannot lead to contradictions. Now, Kant's formulation of humanity in the second section of his work, Categorical Imperative, states that as an end in itself, humans are required never to treat others merely as an object of profit-making, but always, additionally, as ends in themselves. Therefore, do not dehumanize, rather humanize. And now at the root of the capitalist system is precisely the issue of how human beings are treated. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, humanity fell into a pitiful state. That's in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. So sorry was the state of man that the Catholic Church stepped in the Western world. The Church issued an interesting encyclical, a publication issued directly by Pope Leo XIII on the 15th of May. Now, this 1800s or early 1900s document is a historic document and is still referred to even in non-Christian circles, in secular social justice circles today. And it is called the Rerum Novarum, which in Latin means of all things new. And as we know, the Industrial Revolution was something new then. It frowned upon the abuse of workers by industry, and it railed against the dirty, paltry social conditions of the working classes. So it was both Kantian and Aristotelian in its main tenets, dear viewer.
Wow, Tans, it said, let the working man and the employer make free agreements, and, in particular, let them agree freely as to the wages. If, through necessity or fear of a worse evil, the workman accept harder conditions because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice.
Indeed, Nana. And dear viewer, outcomes from poor ethical decision-making have been hitting the headlines recently too, as they did raise eyebrows in ancient times. And the subsequent backlash from the media, the public, and legislators alike has ignited interest in integrating value-added ethics with business processes. And we'll talk about that with viewers later.
So Tans, is this one for all those smart Alex out there who love fast money, quick and easy bucks, and all the goodies that go with cutting corners, and all those who love the things that fall off the back of trucks, and all manner of ill-begotten goods?
Nana, witty you are. From the Gupta scandal, ooh, Nana, did you see the house? Going once, going twice, going under the hammer was the Gupta house in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. 4 more Gupta houses in coveted neighborhoods will also go under the hammer. Probably, do you remember globally the automotive industry scandal, the CO2 scandal actually, Nana, the investment banking toxic debt bundles to multinational tax management, to the exposure of the Panama Papers on tax avoidance schemes? There are a plethora of poor ethical decision-making examples that, while financially advantageous in the short term, were ultimately foolish and led to huge devaluation in both tangible and intangible value for companies and individuals involved.
The country's on a drive for better ethics because good ethics support investment levels. A well-governed economy, research shows, tends to attract better investment prospects for the nation because investors feel that their money is safe. According to the ethical investment company Castle Field, the total investment value for responsible funds has grown to £13.5 billion in the UK, around $19 billion in the US, with yields up to 32% compared to FTSE all-share price at 28% over the same 3-year period, according to The Guardian. So, this proves that a well-run company, being one of strong ethical values and an outlook that reaches past short-term profiteering.
Now, I was there, Nana, at Gibbs when the Chief Justice gave a speech. Chief Justice Mogoeng has challenged business leaders to practice ethical leadership with sincerity and conviction. He was speaking at the launch of the Ethics Barometer at the Gordon Institute of Business Science this week. Mogoeng says ethical leadership is a critical imperative for business.
I stand firm on the point that there is corruption in both the public sector and the private sector in a shocking degree. I reject the notion that corruption can generally be found in the public sector and very little of it in the private sector. No, there are two players here. Look at the toxic material that has been deposited abundantly by some of our business entities, not caring what harm it does to the environment and to our people. That interview by Al Jazeera on what some of our entities have done here in Johannesburg, leaving goats blind and crippled, children mentally disturbed, in pursuit of money, then we've got to check on greed. It's corrupt to do that. Damaging our rivers and dams in the manner that we have done in pursuit of profit is unethical. Cutting down our trees for whatever it is you want to produce out of it. You've got to learn to make profit, but from the heart, driven by a functional conscience, not a deadened conscience, as long as it's money. Cartels, price fixing, predatory pricing. It is the collective responsibility of all ethical leaders in the business sector to reject this and expose them. This thing of using highly sophisticated language or words when it comes to corruption in the private sector is not right. It's not going to take us anywhere. We, just as the public is insisting on harsher sentences for criminals, we have got to insist as ethical leaders in the business sector on harsher penalties for anybody who jeopardizes the livelihood of the poor people of South Africa through practices like price fixing and all those things that go with them. The muzzling out of small businesses through one technique or the other, budgeting handsomely just in case they protest. You know that you have more money, you can get the best of lawyers, just so that they have no possibility whatsoever of either surviving in the business sector or entering that space. Let's reflect, because injustice is unsustainable, good people. You can push it for 20, 25 years, and it can look like this thing is going to work. But it's just a matter of time. Think of the Arab Spring, when people say, enough. We are not fools. We are not going to listen to these PR exercises, these nicely crafted statements that are self-serving. We are not benefiting from these businesses. We're going to do something about it. Let's arrest this thing before it gets out of hand.
I am now joined in the studio, but on the line, by the director of the Ethics and Governance think tank at GIBS, Rabbi Gideon Pogrund. Welcome, Gideon. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Tandeka, and thank you. How are you? And
very well, Gideon. Can you tell us?
Thank you for inviting me on the show.
What led to the decision to institute an ethics think tank and then to have an ethics barometer? What's the thinking behind that?
Well, the principle on which the ethics think tank operates is that ethical behavior builds trust, and that in turn is crucial to ensure a more successful, sustainable future, both for the business community and for the country. So it's really about trying to promote that nexus of ethics, trust, and sustainable success. And we've sought to operate at the intersection of academia and action, combining on the one hand a commitment to independent, rigorous research with, on the other, a clear focus on achieving impact and making a practical contribution.
Now, let's talk about trust, which you have explained briefly in your introductory remarks. On the American dollar, there is the word trust. In fact, it said, "In God we trust." What is the importance of trust in an economy?
Well, I think trust is foundational to all relationships. I mean, not just commercial ones. I mean, if you don't have trust in a marriage and the marriage goes out the window, if you don't have trust between the government and the people, then the people either vote for another party or they have a revolution. And in the same way, in business, trust is foundational. That applies to all your key stakeholder relationships, to your relationships with your employees, with your customers, with your suppliers, with your regulators, and indeed with broader society. If there isn't trust, then those relationships simply become unsustainable. And in a way, the opposite of trust is really fear. And when you have fear, then there's a kind of withdrawal. There's a holding back. And that makes it impossible for relationships to function and indeed flourish.
Now, what is an ethics barometer and how does it work?
Right. So in establishing an ethics barometer, we wanted to address what I sometimes call the soft underbelly in ethical leadership, which is that we may well recognize its importance, But in the absence of a metric, discussions about ethics can become vague, amorphous, and fuzzy. And so the thinking was that if we are going to manage ethical performance more effectively, we've got to somehow measure it. And that's really what this instrument's about. It's about enabling conversations that are rooted in empirical evidence, in data-driven insights, so that those conversations have more credibility and hence the potential for greater influence and impact.
What kind of evidence were you looking at when you constructed this index?
Right, so we built our barometer on a comprehensive assessment tool that was developed by academics at Harvard Business School. And their tool tested whether organizations adhere to global norms and standards, widely endorsed standards around business conduct. We then worked to contextualize and localize their instrument, ensuring that it also addresses specific South African issues and challenges. So we wanted to come up with an instrument that on the one hand was locally relevant, but on the other remained aligned with this global framework. And through that, we came up with what we've called the Gibbs Ethics Barometer for South African business, and we examine employee perceptions around 68 organizational behaviors, which are grouped into 6 categories or constructs and which cut across key stakeholder relationships.
What are those 6,
and they are
Gideon?
How you treat your customers, how you treat your suppliers, how you treat your employees, your organizational culture and practices, how you engage with broader society, and the avoidance of misconduct. As you can see from that list, our approach has been a wide-ranging and an integrated one, and that's because we feel that rather than treating ethics-related issues as being kind of discrete and disconnected, it's more useful to try to locate them under a single umbrella.
And we are coming out of a period in our country where organizations were significantly weakened by lack of governance and lack of ethics. Is this barometer timely, and is it likely to address this crisis that we are just emerging from?
Yeah, I think it is timely. I think that it's timely around the world. I think that globally there's been a shift in our view of the purpose and role of the corporation. Historically, the corporation was seen by many as a kind of amoral entity whose sole purpose is to maximize shareholder value within the parameters of the law. As Milton Friedman famously put it, the business of business is business. And what you've had gradually over the last couple of decades is a shift, is a transformation in that view, with people increasingly seeing the corporation not as an amoral entity, but as a moral protagonist, which is subject to a broader set of expectations. What's our purpose? What values should guide our behavior? What do we owe others? I mean, of course, our shareholders, but also other stakeholders, our employees, our customers, our suppliers, and the general communities in which we operate. Now, if that shift has been a global one, I would argue that in South Africa, it's especially relevant, it's especially urgent because of the huge ethical and social problems that we face. And sort of touching on what you were speaking about earlier, it's become critically important for business to become more inclusive in its approach, more inclusive so as to secure the conditions for its long-term success.
And what about its role in solving the main problems of society? What's the optimal role of business in society, Rabbi Pogrund?
Well, I think that given the size, the power, the influence of corporations, it follows that corporations have substantial responsibilities. That, in other words, it's not really viable just to retain this view that the business of business is business. Business has to think about how it makes social impact. Paul Polman, who until recently was the CEO of Unilever, defined sustainability as the right given to companies to make profits long into the future in exchange for contributing to human progress. So I think that it's critical for business to think about social impact. At the same time, while it's wrong to say that business should do nothing, I think it's equally wrong to expect business to do everything. Business, has significant resources, but those resources are also limited, and it's got to make profits. But I think it's got to make profits in ways that are responsible, in ways that are inclusive, and indeed that is vital if business is to survive and succeed in the longer term.
What about the situational ethics of South African business? What obligations or role can they play in righting the wrongs of the past?
So I think that's an important question for business to grapple with. Certainly, as we strive to achieve a more just and inclusive society, it's vital that business plays its part in correcting historical wrongs, and that is indeed one of the one set of behaviours that we interrogated with the ethics barometer. We wanted to test employee perceptions around whether their organisations were genuinely committed to transformation and in what ways they were seeking to correct historical wrongs. We wanted to understand whether employees thought that their organizations were correcting historical wrongs through, for example, skills development, hiring practices, promotion practices, community development, selection of suppliers, equity ownership, and land and property ownership. So I think, yes, that question is a really important one in South Africa. And that's actually, that was a key part of what we called the contextualization and localization that we carried out in developing the instrument, because while we wanted to draw on this global framework, we had to make sure that it was locally relevant, and it was really important to interrogate those sorts of issues.
Thank you very much for joining us.
South African context.
Thank you, Gideon. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us this evening. Now we link to an ad break. Welcome back. Now, former British Labour MP Lord Peter Hain says state capture and corruption can't only be aligned with government and public officials, but also with the private sector. The former anti-apartheid campaigner told the Zondo Commission he found it strange that those in authority in South Africa hadn't seen the warning signs of state capture, yet it was all over the media, he said.
International actors played a crucial function in the capture of the state.
Lord Hain says several international institutions deliberately turned a blind eye to state capture.
It was international actors who helped and continue to help corrupt individuals to enjoy the spoils of their illegality by allowing them to move their ill-gotten gains from South Africa, and then sometimes, as in the Estina dairy farm scandal, back into South Africa undetected.
Among them, 3 global banks which he says enabled state capture. Lord Hain says the Bank of Baroda, HSBC and Standard Chartered allowed money laundering and looting by the Gupta family.
The banks concerned did not stop it. They allowed it to occur, and therefore they're culpable, in my view, in state capture and are complicit in this corruption and looting.
Hain also slammed international companies including KPMG and Hogan Lovells for their complicity in state capture.
They earn fat profits out of these operations, but they actually assisted with the looting indirectly. They were not personally responsible for the looting, but they gave advice and assistance in their professional capacities to the Gupta brothers that enabled it to continue.
He bemoaned countries who failed to take action.
It is incumbent upon governments around the world, my own in the UK should be at the head of the queue, to accept that they have a responsibility for what happened in South Africa.
He's also slammed South Africa for dragging its feet in dealing with the matter.
Its president, whom I admire and I think is widely respected across the world, is President Ramaphosa. I just think they need to make decisions more quickly and act more quickly, and I hope that that might be something that your commission could investigate.
Last month, the US imposed sanctions on the controversial Gupta brothers. Haynes says he's also penned a letter to the British government to impose similar sanctions. Manqoba Mchunu, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Welcome back. I'm now joined in the studio by Institute of Internal Auditors Acting CEO Charles Nell. Welcome, Mr. Nell. How are you?
Very fine, thank you, Tandeka.
Well, thanks for joining us. You also have an ethics index. Can you tell us about the ethics index that you just launched yesterday?
Yes, the index has been running for a period of 7 years, and it's been looking from the point of view of internal auditors and heads of internal audit at 7 dimensions. And it determines and says this is the state of governance in the country and the way internal auditors see it from inside their organizations.
Now, can you just tell us what those 7 areas are and what's the logic behind the index and why even have one?
Well, if we're looking at the state of governance in the country, what you want to do is get an inside view to organizations, which we don't very often have. So looking at internal auditors, they are supposed to have a bird's eye view of what's happening in their organizations, and they should be able to give us an indication of what state the organization is in. So the 7 dimensions we're looking at is ethics, leadership, internal audit focus a lot on risk. So external risk, is it being addressed? What is the internal risk or the operational risk within the organization? Compliance, obviously then looking at the production side of the business, and finally having a look at assurance to see whether production and all the other factors are linking together.
Now, do these legislative and compliance requirements actually work? Because the Companies Act has been requiring since 2009 that companies have on their boards a social and ethics committee. But since 2009, we've had a slew of ethical crises in this country. How do you account for this?
I think if we look at both public and private sector, mandated for the private sector, social and ethics activity is something the board needs to have a look at. It looks at a number of aspects, and it's a requirement from the Companies Act. Ticking the boxes doesn't necessarily mean that you know what's going on in the organization, and it's something which is run at board level. So if we have a look at the areas where we've had problems in the country, it's been at the executive level, at the leadership level, where the big frauds have happened, and very difficult to detect those if you're not directly involved in the company each and every day of your life.
But I mean, that's the reason why boards have oversight over the executives, and boards should be really rigorously interrogating the financials, the ethics of the company, drilling far deeper into the culture and the performance of the company, not only against the bottom line, but against those ethical and social obligations.
That's quite correct, and it is even broader than that, because you must be able to link all the activities of the organization. Is risk being managed correctly? Are the real issues coming to the fore? There are a whole lot of other committees as well, just besides social and ethics. There's the audit committee, which is responsible for the financials and have a big say. They look at the auditing side and the internal auditing side, and they look at the operations from an audit point of view. So it's getting the full picture and being able to assimilate the results of the full picture and then asking the difficult questions.
But how helpful are these matrices and these indexes and these barometers if people can run roughshod over the basic requirements of being a non-executive director? You should be independent, you should scrutinize, you should have sufficient skepticism, and you should really interrogate the conduct of executives.
That's quite correct. I think one area where we can have a good look at performance of directors is, are they bringing the outside information that's available in the public space back into the business? So if we look at a lot of the things, and Peter Hain made reference to it, he said the indicators were there, but we didn't take a look at them.
That's precisely what I'm trying to get a grip on.
Yeah.
How do we move beyond ticking boxes, perfunctory compliance? In fact, that kind of box ticking is malicious compliance, because you comply in
That's
writing and on the papers, but you have no intention of altering real, meaningful behavior.
And that is where the issue lies in most of the cases. You have to go and look at the behavior behind why certain things are happening. Things can be hidden away, and leadership can take certain actions where they hide activities away. I think that's where internal audit is coming. We know in this country there's been huge pressure both in the public, and surprisingly we did a survey during this year on the plight of internal auditors. We called it the plight of internal auditors.
What did you find?
We found that there's a lot of pressure both in the public and the private sector.
What do you mean by pressure, sir?
Pressure to hide results of audits and outcomes.
Pressure to hide results of audits and outcomes.
Within the organisation and the outcomes, and to sidestep issues. So yes,
and
there is pressure.
have auditors tended to buckle to the pressure to hide results and audit outcomes, adverse audit findings?
I think we need to distinguish between external and internal.
Right.
The one is legislated, the other one you work for the organisation. You have to take the best interests of the organisation at hand, and you can raise issues, but it essentially is the leadership and the board who are going to make the decisions on whether they're going to take action or not.
But shouldn't internal auditors also report wrongdoing?
They do. They have opportunities to report wrongdoing. I think we've had incidents in the country where internal auditors have been shot, and we know of an incident where at least one has been killed because of the action that they have taken. So yes, they are under pressure to put things away. Other actions that have been taken is to suspend them for 2 years.
Suspend them for 2 years?
Yeah, so they can't perform. So you have a number of different mechanisms which are looking at the profession and saying, okay, how can we make it ineffective? In addition, it's not a regulated profession, so there's nothing which forces membership of a body like the Institute of Internal Auditors. And as a result, we have a number of people who we know practice there who we have no control over, to look at whether they're performing correctly and whether they are in fact acting ethically. And I cannot take any action against somebody who's not a member.
If you are so hamstrung, what is the use of the index itself? If you're unable to take action, unable to raise many of the issues in an official way, what is the benefit to businesses of the index itself?
The index came from the point of view of looking at business and saying, this is what internal auditors are saying. It's an anonymous index, so the results are kept anonymous. If we have a bad outcome, why is it there? And it's to look at the overall outcome, in fact, and say, start this as discussion points within your business, and look at the areas. Where does your business fit the patterns that don't map to
How
good
ethical are
behavior?
South African businesses according to your survey?
I think on the good side, over 50% are ethical. On the bad side,
So it's
less than
pretty
50%
half-half.
it's a little bit more ethical than non-ethical. If we look at the index is made up of, we strongly agree that we're ethical, for instance, or somewhat agree that we're ethical. That percentage, if we take that percentage, it's significantly more in the 60-70%. So the majority of those who were surveyed or came up for survey, yes, the majority are ethical. I think in South Africa we've had a big number of, or not necessarily a big number, but a small number of big events which have brought the country to some extent into disrepute. about its business practices. And I think the majority want to do business correctly.
So you're saying we've bottomed up and we're showing an uptick and we're moving upwards and we're behaving better? What exactly are you finding?
I think we've had a very, very slight movement in the index this year.
Movement upwards?
Movement upwards, the overall index of about 3.5%. It's small. It's significantly small. What was very encouraging about that movement was that the highest percentage was in the operational risk area, which means that businesses are starting to focus and leadership is starting to focus on making sure that their operations are starting to run in a better fashion. And that for me is a positive indicator, because that's where you start to turn businesses around, and that's where you start to develop good ethical behavior. So maybe there has been some turn of leadership in the ethical space and in the business space and in the risk management space. And we certainly hope that in the future this trend is going to continue.
Now, looking at your index briefly, I see that you looked at both the public sector and the private sector. And how do those stack up against each other in terms of ethics?
In terms of ethics, I don't have 100% of the results in my memory, but I think if we're looking 50-50, so the results this year were actually, the survey was very interesting because we had about 50% in the public sector and 50% private sector, whereas previous years it's been rated a little bit more 60 in the public sector, 40 in the private sector.
But
So
I mean, I guess the question about public sector ethics and private sector ethics is a bit artificial, because in a national business culture or in a national culture, the two are interlinked. And when you have major public sector corruption, chances are the player in the game is the local and domestic and international, as Peter Hain pointed out, private sector.
that is always in the government
Takes
space.
two to tango.
It takes two to tango, yes it does. So there's always public and private sector involvement. I think we've had some public sector use of funds which has not been correct and not necessarily used in the purposes for which they should have been done. And that was not entirely business related, so mechanisms were created in private sector to strip funds out of the state sector. That was malicious and not business practice, so there was no intention ever to create business in that space. I think we need to separate that out from where business practice, and I think you had the...
Now, if I were a CEO and you were to advise me on what best use I can make of your ethics index, what would you say is one significant take-home that I must pay attention to?
I think look at the index, map it to your business, and start discussing the areas where you have issues in your organization. I think we need to bring the discussion of ethics to the fore in the country, in all areas of the country and within businesses, so we can get an understanding of how we as a nation, to a large extent, are reasoning around ethics. And I think we might get some surprising results in that space.
Well, that's where we have to leave it for this evening. Thank you very much for explaining this index for us and the viewers. We might just take another stab at the index after this quick break. Stay with us, please. Don't go away. Now, I'm still joined in studio by Institute of Internal Auditors Acting CEO Charles Nell. Now, Mr. Nell, won't you just explain to me finally as well, when we codify behavior and we put it in little boxes and we prescribe it as ideal or recommended conduct by a corporation or by individuals, aren't we really not getting to the real issue? Because people behave in these ways in secret and behind closed doors, knowing full well what the rules say, what the codes of conduct say and what the legislation says.
That's very often the case, yes. And I think individuals, if we're looking at ethics, it's always about what are you prepared to do when nobody's watching you? Are you going to do the right thing, or are you going to do the best for society? If you're in a position where you're going to take profits from a business, are you going to take those profits at a value which is going to add value to everybody else and give others the opportunity to utilize that value in their lives? So I think value coming from businesses and ethical behavior in businesses, would I do something when nobody's watching me that I would not do in the public space?
Now, in preparation for this discussion with you and with Rabbi Gideon, I read through the work of a Harvard professor called Michael Sandel, and he writes on the moral limits of markets. And he says that if we were to incentivize good behavior, we might not necessarily get the outcomes we desire, because good behavior is its own reward. And for example, if we were to incentivize whistleblowing, how we would make it far more likely that we will get false blows of the whistle, because people are out for the monetary incentive and therefore blow the whistle not for public good but for the monetary incentive. What do you think about ethics that are incentivized, or something like incentivized disclosures?
I think incentivized disclosures work at certain times. If it becomes the norm, then there would be an expectation, if you reveal something, that it's going to be utilized and give you some value instead of doing what is right. And I think it comes from internal, and I think it's internal to each individual, that they would act ethically in the way which they would expect to be seen by others. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the ethical behavior shown by me or shown by you or anybody else in the studio is going to be exactly the same given the same situations, because of our backgrounds and the way we grew up in our cultures. And I think that's where the debate needs to happen in South Africa, is what is acceptable ethical behavior in business? Is price fixing acceptable? It was in the past.
People say that you need to ratchet up the consequences for bad behavior if you want to achieve good behavior. But what Sandel seems to be saying, which is extremely interesting, and it is that if you give money as an incentive for doing the right thing, you might not get the result you want.
That is quite possible. And if we look at what is the reason behind why individuals become corrupt, what is it? It's greed. If you're giving that incentive for good behavior, does it not feed the same symptom?
Well, it seems that society has a problem here, and we have an intellectual quandary here, because a culture of doing good is a desirable thing, but how do you create it without using incentives and disincentives? So how do you create an ethical culture in an organization? Could you advise?
I think it's taking action when certain behaviors are incorrect, and incentivizing to some extent good behavior when results are achieved. So it's a mix. It's not just
so it's stick and carrot.
It's not necessarily, but it's to get everybody into the same space, and that's where leadership comes in. What is the expectation, and what is the delivery by each and every individual within the organization, and what's that ethical framework that's acceptable to the organization. And that's where the discussions and the debates need to happen, to say why is ethical behavior or certain behaviors incorrect? Because each person might not understand it in the same way.
Now, in South Africa, coming out of the period in which greed was perceived as good, and now trying to create a new national corporate culture that is ethics-based, you can understand the quandaries of leaders on exactly what tools and which values to instill and how to instill those values. And that is why perhaps your ethics index is interesting and useful. But that's all we have for you tonight, and that's where we'll have to leave it. Well, good night and good luck with that exam.